Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started here, and others will join in as they enter the call. So I want to welcome everyone to tonight's discussion. My name is Keisha Rogers. You're joining us on our LaRouche PAC class series. And if this is your first time joining the discussion, we are actually hosting a three-part class series with Brian Lantz, my colleague here in Houston, Texas. And Brian is taking us through the fascinating discovery of a very profound thinker by the name of Lyndon LaRouche. And I know people know that this is the LaRouche Political Action Committee, but many of you may be not be so familiar with who Lyndon LaRouche is. So when we talk about the discovery of Lyndon LaRouche, it's, well, who is this man that he actually made a discovery? Who is Lyndon LaRouche that he is a profound individual in history? Although Mr. LaRouche has passed away just a few years ago, his ideas and his contributions are very essential and critical to address the crisis which confront mankind, and his understanding of what the role of the individual in history is based on his discoveries of of the principle of the science of physical economy. So actually tonight's discussion is themed, how did LaRouche discover the measure of a human economy? Which should provoke some thought in you, because when you think about economy, what is the measure of a human economy? What do you mean? How, when we learn about economics, we take economics and they ask you to cut out the clippings of the Wall Street Journal and ask you what's the Dow Jones figures for the day? What do you mean he made a discovery on human economy, or the measure of human economy? What does human have to do with economy? Very interesting question. So Lyndon LaRouche is the most profound and prolific economic forecaster. And Brian is going to get into this in detail. Last week, he actually took you through some of the fundamental discoveries of LaRouche's economic forecast over almost a 60-year period. And he's going to take us through by what method does Lyndon LaRouche make these forecasts and what is his discovery. So I look forward to hearing from Brian on this. And later on, I'll share with people, but on the LaRouche PAC website, I'll share it in the link as well and in the chat for people to look at a little bit later on when you go back and watch this on YouTube. But Lyndon LaRouche on our LaRouche PAC website has a whole history of his discoveries in the science of physical economy and economics, and it's called On LaRouche's Discovery, and it has some exciting videos on the power of labor, and we'll get more into that. So this is the second class. I encourage people to go back on the website and watch the first one, and then to join us next week for the third and final class of On LaRouche's Discovery. And we're trying to put a lot into 3 classes when we think about all of the contributions made by Lyndon LaRouche. So once you hear what Brian has to say, you're going to have a lot of homework to do and a lot to go back and figure out, well, why don't I know more about this profound individual? So Brian, why don't you get us started?
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Keisha. Thanks for that introduction to Lynn. And this is really overall the series is an introduction to Lyndon LaRouche. And absolutely, you need to explore on your own. And one thing that Lyndon LaRouche was all in favor of was axiom busting. It's not a straight line. Well, let me just start. I want to begin with just again a note on Lynn's education as a youth growing up. I mentioned this in the discussion after the video ended. last time, but so I want to put it up front here. You know, between Lynn grew up in New England, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. He grew up in the Quaker faith, Society of Friends. He essentially committed himself at a very early age to a rigorous education, a wonderful education. At the age of 12, he decided he was going to work through all the known major philosophers and decide which one was his choice. He chose Wilhelm Leibniz. He throughout his life, early life, was extraordinarily involved in culture, but particularly in music and poetry as well. He wrote poetry. Just a couple of examples. When he was in India, you know, in service, he, despite his Quaker background, he made the decision to go into the U.S. Army in World War II, and served in the Burma theater. He was in India. I believe this is right after his service. He was on his way back, but he was in India for an extended period. And there he heard a recording on the radio of a Tchaikovsky symphony, I believe, conducted by the German conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler. And he was struck by the amazing quality of that performance. It wasn't coming to it for the first time. He was hearing it in a different way, performed, as he later said, between the notes, as he thought Furtwängler had performed it. But also his study of Schubert's Wanderer fantasy. And so he mentions these things in his autobiographical notes here and there. So I think it's really important to just bring that in terms of context, because it's also something that very much informs LaRouche's approach to education and the kind of education we need to be providing people today. So just to continue, I just would stress the issue of philosophy, but specifically, he's talking about the European tradition of philosophy beginning really, you could say, with Plato and the combination of that Greek tradition, Greek classical tradition with Christianity, but extending into the Mosaic tradition of Philo of Alexandria and into Islam as well. The notion that man is made in the living image of God. And therefore philosophy is what he otherwise termed, to avoid all the confusion about the word philosophy, epistemology. That is the discovery of the underlying hidden axioms that govern one's thinking. That it's this axiom busting, the discovery of new conceptions to order one's thinking and order one's understanding of the world. This is what's critical in terms of the educational process, as opposed to rote learning, memorization, and so on and so forth. So this involves, just briefly, this involves paradoxes. That's what you know first. You know a paradox. What's that? Why is that the case? Then there's the hypothesis, you know, a thought, a cognition. The paradox prompts a discovery of some underlying principle, not visible, but a principle guiding that somehow is behind this paradox that you're confronted with. And then there's the validation of that discovery. Of course, it could be a false hypothesis, but a real hypothesis is then validated by sharing it with another, by sharing the result, the validation, the discovery itself, but also starting from the paradox, sharing those, and then in sharing those, 1 and 3, so to speak, the person or persons that discovery is shared with, the second in this order, 1, 2, 3, is prompted in the other person. And so cognition, the discovery, is passed on through a process of replicating the discovery, scientific discovery, for example. Or you think of children and children's play and how children actually learn through discovery, happily learn through discovery. This is the process of human cognition, human discovery, human thought, a joyful process. And so I want to start with that. But then I want to just move very quickly here to how did we, many of us now, the baby boomers, when we met, or Lyndon LaRouche met us back in the late 1960s and early 70s. I'm speaking specifically of that period. If we think back, this was a very, this was a tumultuous period. The Vietnam War, the assassinations of President Kennedy, and then Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. This was demonstrations. It was also, we were, those of us that were in college at that age, the baby boomers that were in college, we were really wondering what the hell was going on, and trying to sort it out. Where was our role? What was happening? And of course, there was the drug, rock, sex counterculture. And I won't belabor that point, but that was part of this environment. And should we drop out? What could be done? Is this just noise? Is this is society coming apart? And it was into this situation that Lyndon LaRouche, still as a young man in his 40s, intervened on his own, based on a forecast or set of forecasts, as I presented very briefly last week, but particularly the 58-59 forecast, 1958-59 forecast of the 60s, which forecast a decline in the US economy coming out of the 57-58 recession. To just make short of it here, the stagnation in productive jobs, stagnation in the real economy, the underlying real economy, and resulting ferment that could be projected among minorities, among the unemployed, among students, because suddenly the future, if you think of it in terms of the Kennedy era, of the moonshot, the revival of optimism and so forth in the country, was being cut short. That process, the assassinations and so forth, just amplified this process. So, so having said that, let me just go to the economics very briefly, and then we'll get to LaRouche and Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky, the great biogeochemist of Russia, and we'll explore that a bit. But first, when we met Lyndon LaRouche, and I'm going to use an example, this struck me at the time, and of course, the people attracted to Lynn, this was in New York City. I was on the West Coast, but initially in the New York City, the Columbia University area, Lyndon LaRouche began classes, equivalent of a one semester class on his economics. That was the core of it, and began recruiting young men and women, graduate students and others, around an analysis of what this crisis was that was going on, what was happening all around us, what in fact was the opportunity of this moment. What was the opportunity that we needed to seize to take the country forward? Lynn was forecasting, a financial crisis, a global financial crisis, a fundamental crisis growing out of this situation into the 60s, but in the period around the late 60s and into early 70s. So, but he framed it from the standpoint of the twofold nature of value. uh, use value, you could call it, versus price. So what are we talking? The twofold. These are two absolutely distinct maximizing principles. Speak of any commodity. There's a price, the price of that commodity, but on the other hand, what Mr. LaRouche pointed out as critical was to differentiate this fundamentally from use value. And that was, what is there's the price, of course, the price in the market, in the so-called marketplace. The use value was the contribution of that good, or you could think of a service, or you could think of institutions. What is the contribution, the value of that good? Let's think in terms of commodities, and how it is consumed, and how that in turn contributes to the future development of society. That's the underlying use value. If a mechanic fixes a car for George Soros, what's the value of that versus what is the real value compared to fixing a car for a doctor or a machinist, so that he or she can get to work and provide productive activity for society. The value, the underlying value, is what's critical. And what Mr. LaRouche pointed out was what we had was a growing, yawning discrepancy between price, what we would now call the financialization of the financial markets, the price, and that underlying actual value of what we were producing. And this was the discrepancy, the contradiction that was leading into a full-blown crisis, a financial crisis, if it was not resolved by changes in policy, fundamental changes in axioms in policy. Now correlated with that, not just a correlation, but intertwined with this, was the concept, as LaRouche presented then, of understanding finite resources. Mankind must, and societies must, advance their scientific and technological wherewithal to overcome apparent finite resources. Given technologies allow one to tap certain resources. And of course, the examples are multitudes. I mean, at one time, coal was not a resource. Iron or whatever, electricity, as we know it today. These were developed as resources. But the point is that at any given point in the society's development and its growth of its population, there's an available domain of resources, a manifold resources available. And it was incumbent upon mankind to make the new cognitive, creative breakthroughs, to change the axioms, to discover new more fundamental principles of nature and the universe, to continue the process of scientific and technological progress and the development of society. And so just to say, this was really quite a shocker. This was axiom busting for young men and women, baby boomers in college, at that time. I mean, society was already being eaten away by consumerism, for example. I mean, much less the drugs, rock, and sex, and the counterculture thing, or other features of the situation. The consequences in society of this endless war in Vietnam and the assassination of a president. There was the consumerism. Completely oriented to, increasingly in a zero-sum game of no development in terms of the economy. It was a matter of, of simply marketing to a consumer market in which an increasing portion of the workforce was no longer engaged in actual physical changes on nature, making the physical changes on nature for man. So this was, this was challenging. This was a forecast of the economy. There's more details, of course, that can be gotten into, but I hope that's at least a thumbnail sketch that there is no mathematical means by which to solve for a variable, a commodity, a single mathematical solution when you're dealing with two totally independent maximizing processes. Many of us undertook studies. LaRouche immediately put to work. You had to make these discoveries yourself. It wasn't a matter of believing what Lyndon LaRouche said. That he wasn't interested. He wasn't marketing to young people. He was challenging them on the basis of what he knew they needed to know. This pamphlet, The Destruction of the Cities, Bankers at the Public Trough, was the work of some of Lynn's collaborators at that time in the early 70s. There in New York City on transit, on the debt, city debt, and so on and so forth. Just an example of this process. Real estate, the price and earnings ratio. This is a good example. A slum dwelling is not worth what it looks like. It's worth a multiple of the rent collected on that building, per year. A multiple, a price earnings ratio, and a multiple of that. And then the building is worth, X number of years at that rate of income. That's the worth of the building. Why tear it down? Why replace it? It's already there. It's not worth the expenditure of money. And so you see here the price, the growing distinction between the price of something and the underlying real physical value. And in August of 1971, in the middle of August 1971, the earth shook. The dollar, President Nixon announced the dollar was being decoupled from gold. Within 3 months, the dollar was floating and other currencies floating against the dollar. And the Bretton Woods system had ended. It had ended in a decoupling, a further decoupling, not a recognition of the crisis, but instead a decision, well, we can't sustain the trade deficits with our gold reserve. We can't redeem the dollars held by France and other countries, Germany and so on and so forth, with gold on request. We're decoupling. We're saying, hey, the dollar is going to continue. We're decoupling it effectively from the real economy, and Mr. LaRouche pointed to this as a critical step towards monetarism, further monetizing the economy, just separating it off, a financialization of the economy, and that also required, over the long term, a process of cannibalization. How can you sustain a growing mass of financial paper? And of course, this comes down to us today, on a fixed or shrinking actual physical economic output. The only way you can do it is by cannibalizing wages, cannibalizing investment into capital formation, which began even in 58, 59 in the United States, later in Japan and Germany. This process was underway, and this would lead ultimately, unless again the corrections, the necessary policies, of a return to American system economic policies, in which the financial system is made subservient to the real economy, were put in place. Unless we return to at least the perspective of Franklin Roosevelt and Kennedy in terms of economic policy, we were going in the direction of fascism. And so this was the analysis, and this analysis spread it out across the country. Well, in 1971, LaRouche was proven correct. And no one else, virtually no one, even among economists, had foreseen this. The so-called built-in stabilizers were expected to sustain the economy. The axioms were wrong. The axioms were busted before the eyes of everyone who wanted to look. And so LaRouche's credibility, if you will, took off, particularly among those that have already been exposed to some degree to his thinking and analysis. There was a number of debates set up, among them with Abba Lerner, the economist there at City College in New York, which LaRouche handily won. He forced Abba Lerner, a so-called liberal economist, to admit that Schacht's economic policies, Hjalmar Schacht, the finance minister of Hitler's Germany, that if Hjalmar Schacht's policies had simply been implemented, that is, a process of cannibalization of the economy, austerity, massive austerity, that Hitler wouldn't have been needed. The audience of students, graduate students, and so forth was just blown away. There were not many debates after that, for the very reason that LaRouche had won it. LaRouche was challenging the fundamental underlying axioms of the entire system as it was then promulgated in the US, of the Federal Reserve, of the IMF, World Bank, et cetera, et cetera. He was challenging those policies. So we can come back to that if it seems useful. I just want to mention very briefly then the whole question of the environmental movement, because this leads into LaRouche and LaRouche's relation with Vladimir Vernadsky and a deeper understanding of man on this planet and man in the universe. So in '68, Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb. He was out there at Stanford University. People probably, some of you remember this book. You may not remember the details. It predicted, this was in 1968, it predicted mass starvation in the world in the 1970s and in the 1980s, but in the beginning, hundreds of millions of people in the 1970s. Well, among other things, Norman Borlaug jump-started the Green Revolution with dwarf grains, dwarf wheat, I believe it was, in Mexico. And the Green Revolution, that real Green Revolution, was on around the world, increasing food production, as similar revolutions have occurred again and again in the development of mankind's development. But that was Ehrlich. In 1971-72, you had the publication of Blueprint for Survival. This was a British study endorsed by the anointed aristocracy of England and blue bloods like Julian Huxley and so forth. And that was followed immediately by the Limits to Growth study, infamous, out of MIT, by Forrester, Jay Forrester, and Dennis Meadows, and a team of more than a dozen other academics. Both of these studies, the Forrester and Meadows study, Limits to Growth out of MIT, was financed by the Club of Rome, used the same method that we discussed last week, that of Norbert Wiener and Norbert Wiener's, shall we say, twin, von Neumann. The method of cybernetics, of information theory, of cost-benefit analysis, of systems analysis, of linear sets of linear equations. In other words, computer runs. The Limits to Growth, if you read the report, It's simply a report on the computer runs. The axioms are stated. Exponential growth in population, exponential growth in pollution and other variables, but linear, just simple linear extension of existing technologies of science and technology. No new scientific revolutions, no new scientific developments. So now think about this. You know, this is a few years after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. In 1969, we had landed on the moon. You know, we were being flooded with an array of scientific and technological spin-offs from the moonshot. Yet this was being buried in part under the effects of the Vietnam War, the crisis that this was creating, and of course the crisis created by the assassinations I've already mentioned. A real body blow to the American psyche. So blueprint for survival, and then limits to growth, and garbage in, garbage out. If you start with the wrong axioms, you get the wrong results. There's nothing in a mathematical system, an individual system, there is nothing that is not already implicit in the axioms of that system. And this is well known. I mean, Norbert Wiener himself was trained by Bertrand Russell in England from the time he was 18 years old. So, I mean, this is where this idea comes from. And of course, Bertrand Russell is one of the early advocates of a mass depopulation of the earth. So you can read his books. He was very public about it. But this is Norbert Wiener's methodology. And then we had the Global 2000 report initiated by President Carter. That was 1980. The so-called the Global 2000 report to the president is the full name. And again, this was the first attempt by the US government. But again, it as stated in the congressional testimony, that this is the first attempt by any government to do, quote, a long-term quantitative projection across the range of population, resource, and environment concerns. And again, the axioms embedded in the system, in the computer runs, was that there would be no essential scientific and technological advance. The outcome of the study was guaranteed by the assumptions built into it, the denial of human cognition. This is the fundamental premise of LaRouche's discovery, of LaRouche's approach to science, to culture. It's identifying what humanity is as humanity, as human beings. And of course, this is what we have today in terms of the enemy, you know, from the Great Reset, the World Economic Forum, but, you know, the Biden collective temporarily occupying the White House. We hope that they'll begin to see the door in next year in 2022, and we'll have a Trump presidency in 2024 to reinstitute the American system of economics, which is what at core LaRouche represents. He represents the scientific working out of those fundamental concepts of progress and the development of ensuring the future for our posterity. But this is this crisis, underlying this crisis, this rhetoric of zero growth, is this attempt to cap global economic development to sustain an existing oligarchical financial system, the modern British Empire, if you will, a monitor empire of central banks and financialization and revenue streams out of a shrinking global economy. And we responded to this this linearity with cognition. If you put up the first slide, if you would, Keisha, LaRouche published in 1983 a book-length response, "There are no limits to growth." And well, I'll hold it up here. It's available. Oh, there we go. No limit. There are no limits to growth. Now, if this is in the context of a political brawl going on in the United States, LaRouche had authored what became President Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, which he began elaborating in 1979. So, but at the same time, this was coupled to the conception of how to overcome the stagnation, the cannibalization of the real economy that was going on at that time, and is continuing. But the climate change hoax, the global warming hoax we have today, again, is simply these computer simulations. It's the same thing. In terms of economists, it's the same thing. Econometrics. This is Milton Friedman. It's von Hayek. They're all obsessed with a mathematical system that they say accounts for use value. When of course it doesn't. They're simply saying the magic of the marketplace will take care of everything, and there's nothing for you to see here. Please go away. Go back to sleep. In terms of these computer models, I mean, just think about it. We can't even predict the weather. You know, we just had in the course of here just December, what was it? Over the course of the night of December 12th and 13th, we've had this massive set of tornadoes strike in the midst of storms in the middle of the United States, impacting particularly Kentucky and the people of Kentucky, but also other states in that area. We cannot predict, we cannot, utilizing these sets of linear equations, models, we cannot predict the weather. You think we can predict the state of nature or the state of the economy by these methods? No. We better build back real infrastructure. We better strengthen our capacity to weather these conditions while we advance cognitive science to better understand and master these processes. But this linear process or processes do not work. Now, let me just now turn to Vladimir Vernadsky. And I think I'm just going to leap here. Keisha, if you will, I have a series of 3 slides here. Vladimir Vernadsky is the most noted, well-known scientist, Russian scientist, since Mendeleev, who gave us the chart of elements, the table of elements, which is not fixed for all time, by the way, but it's fundamental, and he made many other fundamental contributions. But Vernadsky was a biogeochemist. In fact, he basically invented that field of biogeochemistry. He led the development of nuclear science in Russia. He was not somewhere hermetically sealed there on the other side of the world. He worked in Italy, Germany. He visited the Curies in Paris. He spoke at conferences internationally, and you know, is a major scientific figure. Okay, so here we're going to just take, and he's most known for good reasons, as well as for bad reasons because he's misused by the environmental movement. He's known for his book, The Biosphere. But this is a later work. This is 1938. As you can see on the screen, on the fundamental material energetic distinctions between living and non-living bodies of the biosphere. Now, stay with this. This may seem like a leap, but this is getting deeper into our topic here tonight. So here we have it. I'll read through it quickly with you. Some of you are on the phone and can't see the screen, so I'm reading through. He's taking this excerpt from this 1938 paper. From the standpoint of the biosphere, the individual living organism is usually lost from view. In first place comes the aggregate of organisms, living matter. In biogeochemistry, however, in some strictly defined cases, at times it is necessary to pay attention to the discrete organism, to its individuality. It is indispensable to do this in those cases where the activity of man appears as a geological factor, as we see happening now. And the individual personality sometimes becomes vividly apparent and is reflected in large-scale phenomena of a planetary character. The human personality changes, accelerates, and causes geological processes of enormous significance to its presence in the biosphere. The next continuing, there we go. He continues, this is just continuing. We are living in a brand new, bright geological epoch. Man, through his labor and his conscious relationship to life, is transforming the element, the envelope of the earth, the geological region of life, the biosphere. Man is shifting it into a new geological state. Through his labor and his consciousness, the biosphere is in a process of transition to the noosphere, from noetic, cognition, discovery. The process of transition to noosphere. Man is creating new biogeochemical processes which never existed before. The biogeochemical history of the chemical elements, a planetary phenomenon, is drastically changing. Enormous masses of new free metals and their alloys are being created on Earth. For example, one that never existed here before, such as aluminum, magnesium, and calcium. Plant and animal life are being changed and disturbed in the most drastic manner. New species and races are being created. The face of the earth is changing profoundly. The stage of the noosphere is being created. Within the Earth's biosphere, an intense blossoming is in process, the further history of which will be grandiose, it seems to us. In this geological process, which is fundamentally biogeochemical, a single individual unit of living matter out of the totality of humanity, a great personality, whether a scientist, an inventor, a statesman, can be of fundamental decisive directing importance and can manifest himself as a geological force. This sort of manifestation of individuality in processes of enormous biogeochemical importance is a new planetary phenomenon. It emerged and began to manifest itself ever more sharply and profoundly in the course of time during the most recent tens of thousands of years on the background of billions of years of the prior history of the biosphere when this phenomena did not exist. So that's the excerpt from Vernadsky's paper, and I think that's a stunning presentation of man's actual relationship, or a element or important presentation of man's relationship to the biosphere. And Vernadsky's concept of the biosphere is one that's undergoing as well. It undergoes the development of new species. It increases its free energy. I mean, just think about it, metabolism. You know, if organisms simply ate their nutrients, they would soon just run out of nutrients. A fixed, limited body of resources. The development of the biosphere is from the continuing development of the biosphere. It's of living matter within the biosphere. This process is this process of living matter is itself a geological force. But out of this biosphere, as Vladimir Vernadsky has, as we've seen here in this quote, out of this has emerged the noosphere, a new domain. So we're talking about three domains, of non-living, living matter, and man, and man's cognitive capacity. Now, the remaining question, and this I'll just conclude with this, and there is certainly more that could be presented, but I'll conclude with this. Well, how is it that man actually carries out this process of development of the noosphere? What is the means by which he does this? Well, specifically, it's already implicit, I guess you could say, imminent in Vernadsky's presentation. It's the sovereign mental process of individual human beings that stands out as the means by which society in turn increases or improves its practice in the biosphere. Cognitive discoveries by individuals. Again, this idea, as I indicated before, paradoxes that demand hypotheses. The hypotheses in turn requiring validation, the sharing of these ideas, these discoveries, as the very heart of validation. And then finally, the ordering of these discoveries. Each discovery that you make and that you reflect upon, and you reflect upon the ordering of these discoveries, creates a transfinite ordering of these discoveries. This is the progress of the individual. It's the progress of society, of human development, to the extent it is not aborted by really what you have to call satanic forces. And it is the very underlying principle operating in the universe as a whole. Three principles: non-living, living, and man, the noetic, the noosphere. These are three simultaneously operating principles as principles in the universe. This is the basis for man's increasing potential relative population density. This is LaRouche's measure by which we measure our success, the success of economies, looking at the real values not only produced, but how do we reinvest? How do we develop the next generation of human beings to cognitively and creatively, as individuals, as individual personalities and souls? How do we develop these individuals to so enrich further society and its division of labor, its culture, and so on. And the measure of this, in the most fundamental sense, or basic perhaps sense, is that we've increased from a few tens of thousands of human beings to a population of 7.9 billion. A population that was earlier thought, even in the 60s, as being impossible to support by these naysayers, these doomsayers, and their linear, blocked thinking. And just finally, I would emphasize all of this is based on axiom busting. It's based on the capability, the capacity of individuals like you and me to seek out and discover those underlying flaws in thinking and action that prevent further comprehension of the universe around us, and in our communities, our nation, most fundamentally, and it's that exploration and search for those false axioms, including in our own thinking, which is in the basis for discovering the paradoxes, making discoveries, and advancing our society to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. So this cognitive process is knowable. And that's Lynn's contribution. And I would just urge people to go to the fourth of Lynn's 4 laws, where he starts by discussing fusion energy and as a crash program for fusion energy development. And then there's a whole section titled Vernadsky on, I don't have it here in front of me, I'm looking for it right now, but Vladimir Vernadsky on man and creation, an extended poetic end, a kind of stretto of a sort to the entire short paper, the 4 laws to save our nation now. So that was written in 2014. So this is essential to understanding Lyndon LaRouche. So thank you for your attention, and open the floor. Turn it back to you, Keisha.